The most dangerous person in the room is never the loudest one. It's the one who already knows how the story ends. The invitation arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon, tucked between a stack of business envelopes on Claire Whitmore's kitchen counter. Outside her floor-to-ceiling windows, downtown Chicago shimmered beneath a gray sky, traffic lights glowing red against wet pavement. She set down her coffee mug and picked up the cream-colored envelope. The thick paper felt expensive, deliberate, the kind of invitation designed to impress people before they even opened it. Her eyes moved calmly across the elegant gold lettering. Ethan Whitmore and Vanessa Cole request the honor of your presence. A wedding invitation. Claire wasn't surprised. Ethan had always loved an audience. What made her pause was the handwritten note inside. Hope you'll come and see how far I've moved on. No signature. None was needed. Claire stared at the words for several seconds. Then she smiled, not because they were kind, but because they confirmed exactly what she already knew. She folded the note neatly and slipped it back into the envelope. The rain tapped softly against the glass. Somewhere below, a siren echoed through the city. On the dining table beside her sat an open laptop, displaying a spreadsheet filled with numbers, transaction records, and highlighted dates. Unlike the invitation, those documents actually interested her. Her phone vibrated once. An email notification appeared on the screen. The sender was a financial analyst she had been working with for months. Claire opened the message. Attached was another report. Another piece of a puzzle slowly coming together. Her eyes scanned the first page. The corners of her mouth barely moved. She closed the file, reached for her coffee, and took a slow sip. Across town, Ethan was probably imagining her reaction. Shock, embarrassment, maybe even desperation. He likely pictured her sitting alone, staring at the invitation, wondering whether she should attend. Ethan had always mistaken silence for weakness. It was one of the reasons their marriage had ended. What he never understood was that Claire only stayed quiet when she was paying attention. The invitation rested beside the laptop now, insignificant next to the information glowing on her screen. She looked at both for a moment. One represented a performance. The other represented reality. The choice between them was easy. She clicked another file. Several names appeared. Corporate entities, acquisition records, legal filings. Every document connected to a trail she had followed for nearly a year. Nothing illegal about looking. Nothing dramatic about being patient. Yet patience had a way of revealing things pride tried to hide. The rain outside began to slow. Sunlight pushed through the clouds, casting a pale reflection across the glass table. Claire closed the laptop and gathered the papers into a slim black folder. Her movements were unhurried, controlled, the kind of calm that comes from preparation. On the counter, the wedding invitation remained untouched. For a long moment it looked less like a summons and more like evidence. Ethan thought he was inviting his ex-wife to watch him win. What he didn't know was that Claire had already seen the board, counted the pieces, and quietly made her first move long before the invitation ever reached her door. The next morning arrived bright and cold. Sunlight spilled across the hardwood floor of Claire Whitmore's condo as the city slowly came to life below her. Steam rose from a fresh cup of coffee beside her laptop. The wedding invitation still sat on the corner of the table, untouched since the day before. It looked important. It was not. Claire's attention remained fixed on the screen in front of her. Rows of numbers stretched across multiple spreadsheets. Dates, account transfers, corporate filings, small details that most people would scroll past without a second glance. Claire had learned years ago that the truth rarely announced itself. Usually it hid in ordinary places: a missing signature, a revised filing date, an account that moved money a little too often. She clicked open another document. The timestamp showed it had been uploaded nearly 3 years earlier. Her eyes moved steadily across the page. Then she stopped. A familiar name appeared. Ethan Whitmore. The corner of her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Not because she was angry, because she remembered. There had been a time when she believed every late night Ethan spent at the office was proof of dedication. Back then, She had defended him to friends, to family, even to herself. While he attended investor dinners, she organized records. While he accepted awards, she prepared presentations. While reporters quoted his vision, Claire quietly built the systems that kept everything running. The memories came in flashes. A conference room at midnight, empty coffee cups, stacks of contracts spread across a table. Ethan pacing while she corrected numbers one final time before a major presentation. She remembered handing him a folder and watching him walk onto a stage alone. The applause had echoed through the ballroom. Her name was never mentioned. At the time, she had not cared. They were supposed to be building something together. Years later, she understood the difference between partnership and convenience. Her phone buzzed. A message appeared from Daniel Mercer, a forensic accountant she had hired months ago. Claire opened it immediately. Attached was a summary report. She skimmed the first page, then the second. Halfway down the third page, she noticed a highlighted section. Her fingers paused on the keyboard. Daniel had found another connection. A series of transactions routed through companies that appeared unrelated on paper. Yet the timing lined up perfectly. The pattern was becoming clearer. Claire leaned back in her chair and looked out the window. Far below, people hurried along crowded sidewalks. Yellow taxis slipped through intersections. A delivery truck stopped at the curb. Ordinary people beginning ordinary days. None of them knew that Ethan Whitmore was preparing for the most important public celebration of his life. None of them knew that the foundation beneath that celebration contained cracks. Claire turned back toward her desk. Beside the computer sat a black leather folder. She opened it. Inside were copies of reports, timelines, public records, and notes collected over months of quiet work. There was no dramatic evidence, no shocking confession, just facts patiently arranged in order. Piece by piece, date by date, she slid a new document into the folder and closed it. The sound was soft but final. Across town, Ethan was planning seating charts, speeches, and photographs. He believed the wedding would mark a triumphant new chapter. Claire already knew it would reveal something else entirely. Not because she intended to expose him, not because she wanted revenge, but because truth had a habit of arriving exactly when arrogance stopped looking for it. 3 days later, a cold wind swept between the skyscrapers of downtown Chicago as Claire stepped out of a black sedan and crossed the street toward a 20-story office building. The polished glass reflected the morning sun, turning the entire structure into a wall of silver light. She carried no briefcase, no stack of documents, only the same black leather folder she had carried for months. Inside the elevator, she stood quietly among attorneys, analysts, and executives beginning their day. The digital numbers climbed steadily upward. 12, 14, 16, 18. When the doors opened, a receptionist greeted her with a smile and escorted her toward a conference room overlooking Lake Michigan. Daniel Mercer was already waiting. A legal pad rested beside his laptop. Several pages of financial reports were spread neatly across the table. Claire took a seat without ceremony. Daniel slid a document toward her. "The transfer is complete," he said. Claire lowered her eyes to the page. The numbers themselves were unremarkable. Most people would not have understood their significance. Yet she immediately recognized what she was looking at. A debt position. Strategic. Quiet. Almost invisible to anyone not paying close attention. Months earlier, one of Ethan's companies had borrowed heavily to fund a series of expansions. At the time, investors praised the move. Business magazines called it aggressive growth. Industry analysts celebrated his ambition. Few people noticed how dependent those plans had become on a handful of financial arrangements. Claire had noticed. She always noticed. Her finger rested lightly against the edge of the document. Not because she felt triumphant, because another piece of the puzzle had settled into place. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Nobody will connect this to you." Claire nodded once. That had never been the goal. Visibility was Ethan's preferred weapon. Patience was hers. Through the conference room windows, sailboats drifted across the lake far below. The water looked calm from this height, deceptively calm. She remembered another conference room years earlier. A different table. A younger version of herself sitting beside Ethan as lenders reviewed financing proposals. He had charmed everyone in the room. Investors laughed at his jokes. Bankers complimented his confidence. Afterward, he celebrated over expensive dinners while Claire stayed behind reviewing contracts line by line. Back then, she believed preparation existed to support success. Eventually, she learned that preparation was success. Daniel opened another file. More dates, more transactions, more connections. Nothing explosive, nothing dramatic, just facts patiently waiting for the right moment to matter. Claire reviewed each page carefully. Every signature, every amendment, every revision. Outside, sunlight flashed across the water. Inside, the room remained quiet except for the occasional turning of paper. Nearly an hour later, she closed the folder. Her expression remained calm, but something had changed. Not in the room. On the board. Somewhere across the city, Ethan was finalizing wedding arrangements, approving floral displays, confirming guest lists, and rehearsing speeches. He believed he was preparing for a celebration. Claire stood and buttoned her coat. Daniel walked her toward the elevator. Before the doors closed, he asked a simple question. "Do you think he sees any of this coming?" Claire glanced at her reflection in the polished metal doors. For a brief second, a faint smile touched her face. "No," she said softly. "He still thinks attention is the same thing as control." The elevator doors slid shut. As she descended toward the lobby, the folder rested comfortably beneath her arm. No threats had been made. No accusations had been spoken. Yet somewhere beneath the polished surface of Ethan Whitmore's carefully constructed world, the first hidden move had already been made. The following week moved with the steady rhythm Claire Whitmore had built for herself after the divorce. Long before sunrise painted the Chicago skyline gold, she was already awake. A kettle hummed softly in her kitchen. Fresh coffee filled the air. By 6 o'clock, she was seated at a small desk near the window of her consulting office overlooking the Chicago River. Unlike the sprawling executive suite Ethan once occupied, her office was modest. Clean lines, a few framed photographs, shelves lined with books and financial journals. Nothing flashy, everything intentional. Claire preferred it that way. The morning light stretched across her desk as she reviewed reports from clients. A yellow legal pad sat beside her keyboard. Every completed task received a small checkmark. Every unanswered question received a note. The process looked ordinary, yet the discipline behind it had rebuilt her life one day at a time. Years earlier, after the divorce became public, many people assumed she would disappear. Some expected bitterness. Others expected public accusations. Neither happened. Instead, Claire quietly earned certifications, expanded her consulting practice, and cultivated relationships with attorneys, analysts, and business leaders who valued competence more than headlines. Reputation, she discovered, grew stronger in silence than it ever did in applause. Around noon, she stepped into a nearby cafe she visited almost every week. The owner greeted her by name. A young employee carried fresh pastries from the kitchen. Sunlight reflected off the river outside, scattering bright patterns across the windows. Claire settled into her usual corner table and opened her tablet. New emails had arrived overnight. Most concerned clients. One came from Daniel Mercer. Another came from a law firm. She reviewed both without changing expression. More confirmations. More pieces falling into place. Nothing urgent. Nothing dramatic. Just steady progress. She closed the tablet and looked out at the pedestrians crossing the bridge outside. People hurried through their day carrying briefcases, backpacks, and grocery bags. Nobody noticed the woman sitting quietly beside the window. Nobody would have guessed how many moving parts she was tracking simultaneously. Across town, Ethan's wedding plans were becoming increasingly elaborate. Social media posts revealed floral designers, luxury accommodations, and exclusive guest lists. Friends forwarded photos to Claire occasionally. She never responded. The images held no power over her. The life she had built no longer depended on comparisons. Later that afternoon, Claire attended a private meeting in a historic office building near Michigan Avenue. The conference room overlooked Lake Michigan. Around the table sat attorneys, financial advisors, and investment professionals. Discussions moved efficiently from one topic to another. Documents changed hands. Signatures appeared where necessary. Questions were answered. By the time the meeting concluded, another quiet decision had been finalized. No press release would announce it. No article would celebrate it. Yet the impact would eventually reach far beyond that room. As evening settled over the city, Claire returned home carrying her black leather folder. The lights of Chicago glittered beyond the windows like scattered stars. She loosened her coat and placed the folder on the dining table. Her phone vibrated. A calendar notification appeared. Ethan's wedding was now less than 2 weeks away. Claire studied the date for a moment before setting the phone aside. Then she opened the folder. The documents inside were thicker now than they had been months earlier. More complete, more connected. She turned a page and paused. Everything remained exactly where it needed to be. Outside, the city lights reflected against the dark glass. Inside, Claire closed the folder with quiet certainty. She was not preparing for a confrontation. She was preparing for a moment when preparation itself would become impossible to ignore. The evening of the wedding arrived beneath a clear autumn sky. Chicago glittered with thousands of lights as luxury cars lined the entrance of the Grand Lakeshore Hotel. Valets moved efficiently between polished vehicles. Guests stepped onto the red carpet in tailored suits and elegant gowns. Laughter drifted through the cool night air. Crystal chandeliers glowed behind towering glass windows overlooking Lake Michigan. Inside, every detail reflected months of planning. White roses filled the ballroom. Soft music floated through the room. Servers moved quietly among clusters of guests carrying silver trays and champagne flutes. At precisely 7 o'clock, another black sedan pulled to the curb. The driver stepped out and opened the rear door. Claire Whitmore emerged without hurry. A dark navy gown fell cleanly to the floor. A simple silver bracelet rested on her wrist. No diamonds. No dramatic entrance. No attempt to compete with anyone in the room. She carried only a small evening clutch. For a brief moment, the city lights reflected against the glass behind her. Then she stepped forward and entered the hotel. Several guests recognized her immediately. Conversations softened. Eyes followed her movement across the lobby. Some remembered her from years earlier. Others knew her only as Ethan Whitmore's former wife. A few exchanged curious glances. Claire acknowledged no one beyond a polite smile. Her pace remained steady as she entered the ballroom. The room shimmered with gold light. A string quartet performed near the stage. Waiters circulated through the crowd. Large projection screens displayed photographs celebrating Ethan and Vanessa's engagement. Claire accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server and quietly moved toward the edge of the room. From there, she could see nearly everything. The stage, the dance floor, the head table. Most importantly, Ethan. Across the ballroom, he stood surrounded by investors, business associates, and longtime friends. His tuxedo fit perfectly. His smile appeared effortless. Every few minutes, another guest approached to congratulate him. Ethan accepted each compliment with visible satisfaction. Then his eyes swept across the room. They stopped, directly on Claire. For a fraction of a second, surprise flashed across his face. Then confidence returned. He excused himself from the group and began walking toward her. Several guests noticed immediately. Their attention followed him. Ethan arrived carrying the relaxed smile of a man convinced everything was going according to plan. "Claire," he said warmly, "you actually came." Claire lifted her glass slightly. "You sent an invitation." Ethan laughed. "I was not sure you would want to see all this." He gestured toward the ballroom. The flowers, the guests, the stage, the celebration. Claire followed the movement of his hand before looking back at him. "It is certainly impressive." The answer seemed to please him. Behind his smile, She recognized the same satisfaction she had seen years earlier after successful presentations and glowing press coverage. Ethan enjoyed being admired. He always had. Another group of guests approached to greet him. Before leaving, he glanced back at Claire. "Enjoy the evening," he said. "There are a few surprises later." Claire watched him disappear into the crowd. Around her, conversations resumed. Music continued. Glasses clinked softly. Yet beneath the polished atmosphere, she sensed something else. Not tension. Momentum. The kind that builds quietly before a storm reaches shore. Her phone remained tucked inside her clutch. Silent. Waiting. Across the ballroom, Ethan laughed loudly at something a guest had said. Cameras flashed nearby. Applause erupted from another table. Everything appeared perfect. Claire took a slow sip of sparkling water and observed the room with calm attention. Ethan believed tonight belonged entirely to him. The confidence in his posture made that clear. What he could not see was that every carefully planned moment was moving closer to a destination he had never imagined. The ceremony ended beneath a cascade of applause. Guests rose from their seats as Ethan Whitmore and Vanessa Cole walked back down the aisle beneath warm golden lights. Cameras flashed from every direction. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead. A live band transitioned into soft jazz as servers opened the ballroom doors leading to the reception hall. The energy in the room shifted immediately. Conversations grew louder. Laughter echoed across the polished floor. Champagne glasses touched in celebration. Ethan moved through the crowd like a man enjoying exactly the evening he had imagined. Everywhere he turned, someone wanted a photograph, a handshake, or a congratulation. He welcomed every bit of it. Claire remained near the edge of the ballroom, observing quietly. She watched waiters refill glasses. She watched investors gather around Ethan. She watched guests admire the decorations and discuss the luxury venue. Every detail reinforced the image Ethan wanted people to see. Success, status, control. After nearly an hour, the lights dimmed slightly. A spotlight settled near the center stage. The master of ceremonies welcomed everyone and invited Ethan to say a few words. Applause filled the room once again. Ethan accepted the microphone with practiced ease. He thanked the guests, thanked the vendors, thanked Vanessa and her family. The audience smiled and nodded through familiar wedding remarks. Then his attention drifted across the room, directly toward Claire. A subtle smile appeared, the kind that only someone looking closely would notice. "Tonight is about new beginnings," he said. "Sometimes life teaches you important lessons before you find the right path." A few guests chuckled softly. Ethan paused for effect. "I suppose that is why experience matters." More laughter followed. Claire lowered her glass onto a nearby table. Her expression did not change. Ethan continued. The stories became more personal, more specific. He spoke about mistakes, about failed chapters, about learning what he truly deserved. Several comments drew knowing smiles from people who remembered his previous marriage. None of the remarks were direct enough to seem openly cruel. Yet the target was obvious. Claire noticed guests glancing toward her, waiting, curious to see whether she would react. She did not. Instead, she folded her hands lightly in front of her and listened. The silence encouraged Ethan. He became more confident with every laugh he received. More comfortable, more careless. His speech drifted away from wedding memories and toward business accomplishments. He praised his leadership decisions. He described risks he had taken. He referenced financial victories and corporate growth. Numbers appeared on large screens behind him as part of a celebratory presentation. Revenue increases, expansion projects, investment milestones. Ethan spoke proudly about decisions that had supposedly transformed the company. Several investors nodded with approval. Others listened carefully. Across the room, Claire noticed something different. A few individuals had stopped smiling. One man adjusted his glasses and looked toward another executive. A woman seated near the front checked something on her phone. Tiny reactions. Easy to miss. Ethan missed them completely. His confidence had become momentum. Claire saw something else. a door slowly opening, and once opened, it would not close again. The applause faded gradually, but the atmosphere inside the ballroom had changed. Most guests could not explain why. The music continued. Servers continued circulating with silver trays. The chandeliers still cast warm reflections across crystal glassware. Yet beneath the celebration, something invisible had shifted. Ethan Whitmore remained on stage, smiling confidently as he finished another story about his company's growth. He raised his glass and accepted another round of applause. Then a vibration buzzed against the inside pocket of his tuxedo jacket. He ignored it. A few seconds later, it happened again. And again. Ethan maintained his smile, but his eyes flickered downward briefly. Near the front tables, several executives had quietly lowered their phones beneath the tablecloths. Screens glowed against white linen. Expressions changed. One investor stopped clapping altogether. Another leaned toward a colleague and whispered something. Across the room, Claire noticed every reaction. Not because she was searching for them, because she already knew where to look. Ethan stepped away from the microphone as the band resumed playing. Guests began returning to conversations. Vanessa greeted relatives near the dance floor. Photographers moved between tables capturing candid moments. The celebration attempted to continue normally. Then a man in a dark suit approached Ethan from the side of the stage. The man's expression was professional, but urgency showed in the speed of his steps. Ethan listened as the man spoke quietly into his ear. For the first time all evening, the smile disappeared. It returned quickly, but not naturally. His hand moved instinctively toward his phone. The screen displayed several missed calls. More arrived before he could unlock it. His jaw tightened slightly. Nearby guests pretended not to notice. Most failed. Within minutes, more phones appeared throughout the ballroom. The pattern spread table by table like ripples across water. A board member checked an email and immediately sat upright. An attorney read a notification twice before forwarding it to someone else. 2 investors left the room entirely. Ethan walked toward a quieter corner near the reception area. The confidence in his stride remained, but the rhythm had changed. Faster now, less controlled. He answered one call, then another, then a third. His responses grew shorter each time. Across the ballroom, Claire remained exactly where she had been. One hand rested lightly around her glass. Her expression never changed. She did not check her phone. She did not seek eye contact. She simply observed. Large windows overlooking Lake Michigan reflected the ballroom lights like mirrors. Beyond the glass, the dark water stretched toward the horizon. Inside, conversations became fragmented. Pieces drifted through the room. Audit review, debt position, compliance inquiry, emergency board meeting. Nobody possessed the entire story yet, but enough pieces had surfaced to create uncertainty. And uncertainty was something Ethan had never managed well. Several months earlier, Claire had reviewed every document 3 separate times before making a single decision. Every signature, every filing, every transfer. She understood something Ethan never fully appreciated. Facts moved slowly, until they moved all at once. Another phone call arrived. Ethan stared at the screen before answering. This time he listened far longer than he spoke. His shoulders became noticeably rigid. Nearby guests exchanged uneasy glances. The celebration remained standing around him like a carefully constructed stage set. Flowers, music, champagne, smiles. Yet cracks had begun appearing beneath the surface. And for the first time that evening, Ethan Whitmore looked like a man realizing he was no longer controlling the direction of the story. The ballroom continued operating on momentum alone. Music still played. Servers still moved between tables. Guests still held conversations. Yet every smile now seemed slightly uncertain, as if the room could sense a change before fully understanding it. Ethan Whitmore stood near the reception area speaking rapidly into his phone. His responses were short, controlled, determined, the way a man speaks when he believes a problem can still be managed. Across the room, Claire remained exactly where she had been for most of the evening, calm, observant, detached from the growing confusion around her. A few guests had begun watching Ethan instead of celebrating with him. Others quietly exchanged messages beneath the table. The attention he had spent years learning to attract was no longer arriving on his terms. Then another arrival changed the atmosphere completely. The ballroom doors opened. Several heads turned immediately. Conversations slowed. A tall man in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo stepped inside accompanied by 2 associates. Even guests who had never met him recognized him instantly. Lucas Bennett, founder of one of the fastest-growing investment firms in the country. Business magazines called him one of the most influential entrepreneurs of his generation. Financial news networks followed his acquisitions closely. His reputation carried weight in nearly every major boardroom. The sight of him entering the reception created an entirely different kind of attention. Several investors straightened in their seats. Others whispered his name. Ethan noticed the reaction and immediately ended his call. Within seconds, he was moving toward the entrance with his most confident smile restored. Opportunity had just walked into the room. Lucas greeted a handful of guests politely. He shook hands, accepted congratulations, exchanged brief words with several executives. Yet he seemed distracted. His eyes continued moving through the crowd as though searching for someone specific. Ethan finally reached him. The 2 men shook hands beneath the glow of the chandeliers. Nearby conversations stopped completely. Ethan's posture suggested pride. Having someone of Lucas Bennett's stature appear at the reception looked like a victory. Another symbol of success. Another powerful connection. For a few moments they exchanged polite conversation. Then Lucas glanced past Ethan's shoulder. His attention fixed on a familiar figure standing near the windows overlooking Lake Michigan. Claire. The change in his expression was immediate. Warmth replaced formality. Without hesitation, Lucas excused himself and began walking across the ballroom. Ethan turned, confused. Dozens of guests followed the movement with their eyes. The room seemed to narrow around the path Lucas was taking. Claire looked up just as he approached. A genuine smile appeared on her face for the first time that evening. Not strategic. Not guarded. Familiar. Lucas stopped in front of her. For a brief second, nobody spoke. Then, clearly enough for the nearest tables to hear, he smiled and said a single word. "Mom!" Silence spread through the room faster than any announcement could have. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Conversations stopped completely. Even the musicians seemed uncertain for a moment. Ethan stared from across the ballroom as though he had misheard. Several guests exchanged stunned looks. The word did not fit any story they thought they understood. Lucas leaned forward and embraced Claire warmly. Not as a business acquaintance. Not as a distant mentor. As family. When he stepped back, his eyes reflected unmistakable respect. The room was still trying to process what had happened. Ethan's expression revealed something entirely different. For the first time all evening, he looked genuinely unprepared. And Claire, standing beneath the soft reflection of the ballroom lights, remained perfectly calm as the assumptions of an entire room began collapsing around her. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The ballroom seemed suspended between one reality and another. Lucas Bennett stood beside Claire Whitmore with the ease of someone who had nothing to prove. Around them, hundreds of assumptions quietly unraveled. Ethan Whitmore remained frozen near the center of the room. The confusion on his face was impossible to hide. Guests who had spent the evening watching him now found themselves watching Claire instead. Lucas smiled as though the moment were completely natural. "You have not changed at all," he said warmly. Claire laughed softly. "That is a generous statement." Several nearby guests exchanged bewildered glances. One investor finally stepped forward. "Lucas," he said carefully, "forgive me, but did you just call Claire Mom?" Lucas nodded. "Because she is." The silence deepened once again. Then he clarified before anyone could misunderstand. "Not by birth. By choice." His eyes shifted toward Claire. Respect filled his expression. 20 years ago, when my father lost everything, I was preparing to leave college. Tuition was impossible. I thought my future was over. An anonymous scholarship appeared a week later. He paused. I did not discover who created it until years afterward. Guests listened without interruption. Even the musicians remained silent. Lucas continued. That scholarship paid for my education. Later, when I wanted to launch my first company, Claire introduced me to people who cared more about ideas than connections. She never asked for recognition. She never asked for repayment. She simply helped. Across the room, several executives slowly turned toward Claire. Ethan's expression tightened. Lucas was not describing the woman Ethan had spent the evening reducing to a failed chapter. He was describing someone entirely different. A woman whose influence had quietly shaped lives without demanding applause. One of the investors near Ethan lowered his phone and looked directly at Claire. Then another. Then another. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Respect had entered the room. Real respect. The kind that could not be manufactured by speeches or luxury decorations. At the same moment, another notification appeared on multiple phones. More messages. More updates. More questions regarding Ethan's business affairs. The whispers returned. Board review. Financial exposure. Emergency discussions scheduled for Monday morning. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody accused him publicly. Yet the contrast had become impossible to ignore. Claire had spent years building quietly. Ethan had spent years building visibility. Tonight, both results stood side by side beneath the same chandelier lights. Ethan took a step forward as though preparing to regain control of the room. Then he stopped. There was nothing left to perform. The audience had already changed. Claire reached for her evening clutch. Her movements remained calm and unhurried. She turned toward Lucas and touched his arm lightly. Thank you for coming. Lucas smiled. I would not have missed it. She nodded once. Then she began walking toward the exit. No dramatic speech followed. No confrontation. No celebration. Guests parted naturally as she crossed the ballroom. Several people offered respectful smiles. Others simply watched in silence. Ethan stood motionless near the stage as she passed. For the first time all evening, neither of them spoke. Words were unnecessary. Claire reached the hotel lobby and stepped through the revolving doors. Outside, the Chicago skyline glowed against the night sky. Cool air greeted her as she descended the front steps. Behind her, the ballroom continued buzzing with conversations she no longer needed to hear. Ahead of her, city lights stretched for miles. She paused for a moment and looked across the avenue. Then she smiled. Not because Ethan had lost. Not because she had won. But because years earlier, when everything fell apart, she chose to build instead of break. And in the end, that choice had changed everything. The evening had begun as a celebration of appearances. It ended as a reminder of something far more powerful. The loudest person in the room never controlled the story. The person who quietly prepared for the truth did.